Hello, welcome to Space, the Next Frontier for Money Laundering. I'm Hugh Taylor. I'm here with Mark Feldman, my co-author. We are just getting off here, and I'm going to ask people to mute themselves. If you have a question, we ask that you put it in the chat. We'll get to questions at the end of the session. We're recording today, so if you're not able to sit through the whole thing, we will be publishing a link to a recording in the next couple of days. And you'll have to forgive me in advance. I am sort of also managing like the attendance, logging people in and so forth. Anyway, why don't we get started? We're going to go through a presentation for the next 30 to 40 minutes, then open it up for Q&A. So the agenda for today, first, we're going to tell you a little bit about who we are. Then we're going to provide an overview of money laundering, which is a subject that you're probably familiar with, but we felt it would be good to just, as a starting point, talk about how money laundering works, and then how firms fight against it, which is anti-money laundering, or AML. And we're going to talk about the challenges that money launderers have. We feel sorry for money launderers because they have trouble, but we're going to talk about how space as an industry and a sector solves a lot of the problems facing money laundering. And now this is a problem where what's happening today versus tomorrow is a significant issue because there's a lot of stuff we're talking about that is a little bit futuristic. Now, and then we're going to talk about some space money laundering scenarios, and we're going to interject some opinions we've heard from lawyers who cover this topic, and they have an interesting difference of opinion. And then we're going to examine some implications for businesses and financial institutions. So I just want to very briefly introduce ourselves. As I said, I'm Hugh Taylor. Mark Feldman and I are the co-authors of this book, Space Piracy, Preparing for a Criminal Crisis in Orbit, which is coming out in the next couple of weeks from John Wiley and Sons. My background is primarily in technology and cybersecurity. That's how I got to be involved in this project. And Mark, you want to introduce yourself for a moment and maybe talk a little bit about our think tank?
Sure. My name is Mark Feldman. I am, as you mentioned, co-author. My background is in space and investments, mostly private equity and venture capital. And I have a Latin background as well. I was an assistant to a former U.S. ambassador to Mexico, a direct report to Ambassador John Gavin. And with him back in the 1980s, I was a bit of a spear carrier in putting together Mexico's first satellites in conjunction in a private-public partnership with the largest media company in Spanish, Televisa/Univisa. And I got to see really and directly involved from concept to launch to marketing the transponders and subcarriers, the entire process of concept to launch of satellites, worked in family offices, the Disney family offices, involved in venture in high tech and as well as space. And you and I, in addition to writing this book, basically have focused and put together a modest think tank, NASA think tank, focusing on the issues of space piracy. It's also crime, and connected with that, governance of what happens after there's habitation or even mechanical habitation on asteroids, planets, and other platforms in space.
Great.
And
So let's dig into it. And we will, if you want a copy of these slides, please just send us an email or put your email address into the chat, and we'll get you a copy of the deck if you want to go over them. We know there's a lot of words on the screen here, but money laundering today, and this has been going on at least for 100 years, starting with Al Capone, who bought a chain of laundromats to clean his dirty money. That's where the expression comes from, is that it's a three-step process that begins with the acquisition of illegal money through illegal activities like crime. And step one is called placement, meaning you have to put your illegally earned money into the financial system. You can't just deposit it in a bank. And this usually happens by depositing in offshore accounts and that sort of thing. The second step is called layering. And if you follow this little diagram from left to right, this is where the big dollar sign is with the little dollar signs coming out. And you're separating the illegal money from its source. And this may mean putting it into different corporate accounts of shell corporations and so forth, so that it's harder to trace back to its source. And then the third step is criminals need to get their hands on the money again, and this is called integration. And it typically involves things like buying real estate, um, vehicles, that sort of thing. And that's how the criminals get their hands on their money so that they can, spend it and enjoy it. And some of the current approaches are real estate, shell corporations, trade, meaning buying and selling commodities, construction is a big one. There's also maritime, buying and selling ships in the international market is a good way to move money around and hide where it comes from. And this is a big problem. The estimate from the UN is that it's about a $2 to $5 trillion criminal industry. So it's a bit, and it encompasses a lot of industries and so forth. So it's a big problem. And then but as I said, we're going to feel a little sorry for these people who have to do money laundering because there's a couple of problems that they face. One is it's against the law. There's a lot of regulations coming against you, and there's law enforcement looking for you. And financial institutions have a lot of rules and reporting requirements where they may catch you and have to turn you over to the authorities. And it's hard to move a lot of money around. It's hard to scale. And you know, unfortunately for the money launderer, there's often a lot of money moving around, and it has to be, packaged up into little pieces, and it can be hard to coordinate and scale. Okay, this is an issue. And if you're a money launderer, you're coming up against anti-money laundering, AML policies, laws, and so forth. And basically, any sort of legitimate financial institution, at least in the United States and in UK and the EU, have regulations because they do not want to be facilitating crime, and they can get in trouble too. So they have policies, so-called know your customer, KYC policies, where they want to know, who you are and where you're from and the sources of your money. Also, customer due diligence. There's a lot of transaction screening. There are specialized software packages that look at financial transactions carefully, and they compare them against like watch lists. For example, if there's a transaction at a bank and one of the parties to the transaction is on a terrorism watch list, they'll flag that transaction. They may block it. And they also may be obligated to report suspicious activity to the government, to the Treasury Department, and so forth.
Just let me chime in one thing on the anti-money laundering people that are involved in anti-money laundering activities. There are several cases and several substantial cases of AML lawyers in London were sanctioned by the British Crown for abetting money launderers. So you had a situation that the anti-money laundering experts in one of the most prestigious British law firms they were basically sanctioned for enabling their money laundering clients to launder money.
Yes, this is a problem that sometimes there's a lot of money at stake, and you may have people who are supposed to be controlling it actually co-opted into it. But it is the law. In the United States, it takes the form of the Patriot Act, Title III, which was a law enacted after the September 11th terror attack in 2001, the goal was to tighten the flow of money to terrorists who might attack the United States. But this also now encompasses crime fighting against drug trafficking and other things that the government doesn't want to be happening. So our contention is that space solves some of the problems that money launderers face. So, and I'm going to say this with a caveat that not everybody agrees with us, okay? But what you have in space is high value assets that are basically invisible. If they're in orbit, it's not like a building or a ship or something that you can see. Some of these assets are located in space, which is an area of subjective legal frameworks, or basically law free in some ways. They also take place in parts of the earth, in countries which may not have strong law enforcement or strong rule of law. A lot of money laundering, a lot of space business is cross-border, the transactions occurring between countries, which is a good venue for laundering money. And as we think going out in the future, it could literally be interplanetary between, transactions between entities that are based off Earth, so to speak. Now, obviously, we're getting out into the future. On another front, there's a lot of new ventures entering the space industry. And so the financial field may unknowingly facilitate money laundering by arranging, mergers and sales of ventures that are in the space industry. And as of now, as far as we know, space is not on the sort of watch list. It's not the sort of thing that anti-money laundering people are auditing for, or that their software is trained to catch. So it's operating in an area that's sort of hidden from these controls, and it's a big business. Space is, according to McKinsey research and others, it's on track to become a $1 trillion industry by the end of the decade, and this is really just the beginning. There is even separating out the more fantastical visions, it's going to be a very big business, and there's a lot going on. And with big business comes the opportunity for crime and fraud. And so Mark and I are going to walk you through a couple of scenarios for space money laundering. I'll take the first one, okay, which is international customers paying for space services. So one of our hypotheses here is we think that criminal organizations may involve themselves in space industry for the purpose of money laundering. So when we say, like, for this is an example, an Asian firm paying a cartel-controlled satellite imaging service. So we say cartel could be any sort of criminal organization that's taken ownership of a satellite imaging service, and they've set up a customer. They've placed their money with this customer that is then going to integrate it back to them, used by purchasing overpriced satellite imaging services. And this is a space version of a money laundering practice that happens here on planet Earth, where people sort of overpay for services with a co-conspirator in a money laundering scheme. So that's one. Mark, do you want to talk about buying and selling space
Now
assets?
in the buy and sell aspect of using a satellite as an example, we have on one an American firm buying a satellite from a criminally oriented shell company in foreign countries. That doesn't necessarily have to be sort of a third world or an outlier foreign country. That could be a company like Germany or Israel, or putting together these satellites, and the know-how of putting together satellites is becoming more and more diverse and more, and the challenge and the know-how to do this is much more than it was, let's say, even 5 or 10 years ago. Now, the company buying it, the American company, would probably know exactly what they're doing because it's basically a transaction. Now, the company may not know that the satellite was put together by criminal elements, basically selling the satellite, but it could be another arm of a criminal syndicate in buying and selling that. So you have one organization manufacturing the satellite outside U.S. Touch points, and then an American company buying it, which is basically connected with it, and through various legal LLCs and various other shell companies, these transactions could occur. And it doesn't have to be necessarily satellites. It can be other things connected to space, components You mentioned imaging and various other space-oriented, very space-oriented software or hardware.
Right. We had a very interesting conversation with an attorney who's an AML specialist and former Treasury Department employee who, when we talked about this, said, pay attention to construction contracts. For example, there's a lot of construction going on in equatorial parts of the world, which are very suitable for launching rockets, where this is a classic mode of money laundering, where there's like a construction bid that's overpriced, and it's a way to hide money. Um, another potential scenario is buying and selling space businesses. This is similar to space assets, but this could be, for example, a criminal cartel buying a spaceport in Africa from a shell corporation that's owned by a criminal affiliate. And this is the kind of transaction that is occurring outside of what this attorney referred to as American touch points. One of our sort of notes here is that these kind of schemes would be difficult to do in the United States, because there's a lot of laws and there's a lot of people with their eyes open paying attention to what's going on. But that as these transactions occur outside of the United States, there's potentially more room for maneuvering around the law. And then also just keep in mind that the cryptocurrencies make this could be a big part of this story as well. And then one other thing Mark and I wanted to point out is there are examples of this happening now, this type of practice happening now on Earth. And an example is there's a company called MSC, Mediterranean Shipping Corporation. It's a large operator of container ships. And about 2 years ago, one of their container ships pulled into Philadelphia, was boarded by the Drug Enforcement Agency, which walked off the ship with almost $2 billion worth of cocaine that it was carrying. And what was revealed, and this is really where we think we might see things like this in the space industry, is that a good number of the crew members were actually members of criminal gangs from Central Europe and Latin America. They had infiltrated what is basically a very large corporation, which had claimed to have no knowledge of this. So we think that this kind of criminal activity inside a large corporation could occur in the space sector. Another version of this story is the revelation that a lot of the oil production in Guinea-Bissau in Africa is controlled by Latin American criminal cartels, which are using it to launder money and make money and engage in smuggling and all kinds of things like that. Is that these activities are happening outside of an effective law enforcement environment.
Yes, and I'd like to
Mark.
add that this reality in Guinea-Bissau and oil is an extension of what the Mexican cartels are extremely adept in diversifying out of their quote base industry, which is narcotic trafficking and the growing production and distribution of narcotics. They know that they need to diversify, and in Mexico, the Mexican cartels have been actually quite adept in doing that from agriculture and essentially providing an enormous amount of influence on how Pemex, the Mexican oil company, is run. The Guinea-Bissau, are running the oil business, which is an example of the diversification out. Guinea-Bissau is not just a transit point of narcotics from Latin America, Africa, and Europe. It indicates that when these cartels are diversifying, or international criminal elements are diversifying into legitimate businesses, number two is they have the funds to do things. Space is not cheap. It's the cost of entry and barriers of entry are lessening, but it's still not, something that they can easily just get into as they're used to in real estate and other transactions that are outside narcotics and illegal activities. However, as countries clamp down on their money laundering, there will be more of an incentivization of criminal elements or international cartels to look for other options of money laundering, and that's where we believe space will become an entree point. And once they become involved in it, they will become extremely adept in it. One thing I also want to emphasize is the pure investment aspect of it. They can become limited partners in major venture capital firms or private equity firms that have a space or aerospace component as a major investment focus on these things. Its KYC would not necessarily get into the limited partnership aspect because those can be concealed with limited partners, and so on of LPs within LPs.
Great. So we're going to now go to this slide. We spoke to some lawyers, and we're going to do a paper based on this dialogue. But for now, we talked to one lawyer who was an expert on space law, and we talked to this other lawyer who, as I mentioned, was a former Treasury Department employee who's now a partner at a law firm. They do anti-money laundering, and we got two quite different takes on the potential for money laundering in space. The space lawyer said this is really not likely to occur. And in his perspective was the United States has very strict regulations on launches, licensing of satellites by the FCC if they're used for technology, licensing of launches by the FAA, technology export controls, international agreements like the ITU and the United Nations, and spacecraft registration. Like our hypothesis that you could, sell a satellite to a criminal, he's like, I don't think that's going to happen. Okay. And I respect his opinion, although I think his view was sort of US centric. And I agree with him that this would be a difficult thing to pull off in the United States. In contrast, the attorney who has done AML internationally said that it is in reality quite difficult to police transactions worldwide. You can't be everywhere. You can't watch everything. And it's very difficult to detect activities by non-US entities, such as, for example, she said if Russia launches a satellite, the United States has very limited visibility into what's happening with that satellite financially, unless it involves an American corporation. There's kind of a gray area. There's gaps in tracking cryptocurrency, and enforcement is limited. And if you'll indulge us in sort of a historical bit of humor, we have Joseph Stalin here, who once famously said the Pope was opposed to Stalin's policies, and he asked Molotov, how many divisions does the Pope have? And so we're sort of asking, like, how many divisions do the global space agencies have? Like the enforcement of these regulations may be a little thin. That's an issue that I think everyone's going to be dealing with. Then we want to just take a minute to talk about today versus tomorrow, because, and this has come up a lot in our book, and I'll just show off, we actually got our book. I'm very pleased to show off our first author copies of the book, is that there's a difference between what's happening now, what could be happening in the next 10 years, and what could be happening in the next 50 years. And it's hard to know when things are going to happen or if they're going to happen. But I think in the future, there's some consensus in the space sector that we're going to see business activities involving cargoes from space, such as from space mining ventures, mining minerals and chemicals on asteroids and on the moon, and creating pharmaceuticals in orbital settings. There could also be space rackets. We think it's highly probable that as people and businesses go further into space, you might see organized crime of different kinds happening in a space setting. Space-based businesses, for example, and this is obviously a bit futuristic, but that corporations actually incorporating in space. So instead of being like a Delaware corporation, you could be like a moon corporation, moon-based corporation. Space-based sovereignty, again, pretty far out in the future, but this is certainly, as people like Elon Musk discuss colonizing Mars, this is a question, will a Mars colony be governed under its own law or under law from the planet Earth? And does it matter? If you have people living on Mars, are they going to follow laws on the planet from the planet Earth? And there is some complexity on the legal framework. For example, an American built moon base is subject to American law, but the moon is not. The Outer Space Treaty makes it prohibited for any country to assert sovereignty over a celestial body. Space-based banking and financial institutions and commodities exchanges, these are all venues for potential financial crime. And then we have space, the ultimate tax haven. And again, this hasn't happened yet, but we can sort of imagine if you can set up a corporation domiciled on the moon, you could probably get around a lot of Earth-based taxes until you got caught.
Well, let me give an example of this actually, and it's a little more historically, it's actually happened. Back in the 30s, and in the golden age of Hollywood, there was a 3 mile limit of what enforcement could do. So there was entrepreneurs, criminal element, entrepreneurial activities that put ships outside the 3 mile limit, which were gambling casinos. And there was nothing that the police or the federal or state or local could do anything about it. So projecting a little bit and using the imagination, space could be a vast type of three outside the exclusion zone, 3 miles beyond 3 miles out on the Pacific Ocean, outside away from California, and you could see an enormous amount of how criminal elements, dodgy tax schemes, legitimate businesses who do not want to pay, who want to avoid taxes, could use space for these and other related activities that do not have any enforcement or any law at all.
So the question then becomes, what can be done about this? And so we wanted to take a minute to just return to our anti-money laundering diagram and offer some thoughts on that, which is we think that this is a good time to think about making space business a criteria for AML investigation. So this, coming back to our anti-money laundering figure here, under Know Your Customer, it might be a good idea to cross-reference space entrepreneurs with PEPs, which are people, sorry, I forgot what PEP stands for like people of interest in crime and terrorism and various watch lists, to cross-reference those lists with space, put space people onto those lists. Under customer due diligence, put flags on shell corporations in the space sector, make sure they don't slip under the radar screen, and under screening, to incorporate space-based transactions or space-related transactions into the screening process. And this is a software issue. There's some very sophisticated auditing and transaction monitoring software that could be adapted to include space in its filter set, or what it's looking for. And then also just to pay attention to cross-border transactions and shell corporations in the space business as possible structures for money laundering. So these are some suggestions for people in the AML category. And we think, and this is the premise of our entire book, is that it's early in the cycle. Now is the time to be thinking about it and talking about it, not in 5 years when it becomes a big problem. So that is our presentation. We're now going to open the floor to questions. If you have a question, please type it into the chat. We're going to stop the screen share. And again, if you want to see the slides, just pop us your email address in the chat, and we will send you the slides. And that's good. Do we have any questions from the audience? So far, no questions. Buddies sent me an email. Okay, Mark, it looks like we dazzled everybody so much with our brilliance that nobody has any questions. Oh, wait, Emily has a question. Let me unmute them. Sorry.
Okay. I can also try and say I've got 2 questions. I was writing, but not quick enough.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, good. First question was, so are you concerned about the implications for kind of states under the OST? I think it's Article 6, I believe, is state responsibility. Yeah, that's my kind of first question. My second question is, if you're talking about financial institutions, and we obviously have a lot of background checks going on in terms of like within space, but I'm wondering what you think the role of insurers is going to be in terms of background checks of, kind of also financial checks
Hmm.
of insurers. Um, so yeah, like one is state responsibility, the other's role of insurers.
So, so the question is, what is the role of nation states according to the Outer Space Treaty? I think that with the caveat that these kind of questions can quickly get beyond our real expertise. Our understanding is that, or our sense from talking to people about this and a lot of other issues, is that a lot of what could happen, it will happen outside of the nation state context. It'll involve non-state actors in the same way that existing money laundering works around, money laundering is against the law everywhere, but it's still happening, and it's happening through entities that are hard to track or represent, non-state entities that actually might be quite significant financial entities like terror organizations and that kind of thing, criminal gangs. Um, as far as insurance is concerned, this is not something that we've addressed ourselves to, except for an understanding that we've talked to people in the insurance category, and I think one of them is even on the call here. I don't want to put him on the spot, but if he's interested in addressing this, we'd love to hear what he has to say. Is that the potential for crime and piracy in space is like a new sector for the insurance industry, that currently space insurance deals with, damage to spacecraft or accidents. It doesn't deal with insuring against fraud and crime and that sort of thing. So,
Well, on the thing of the financial institution and sovereignty, we believe we've addressed this in the book. This forum we didn't really go into it, but we believe that one of the major players in space is going to be institutions analogous, not identical, to what the British East India Company or the Dutch Asian companies were prior to the sovereignty and their relationship, as they sort of morphed into, more what we would call legitimate banking institutions. I mean, we know the British East India Company had their own navy, their own armies, and so on. There were some, strange connections with the sovereign, the kings or royalty in England, and the same with the Dutch. I mean, the Dutch royalty was direct investors in these things. So there's sort of like, we suspect there'll be covert relationships and other entities that we don't know, we can't imagine right now, that will be analogous to what they were. Those were there during the days of shipping and maritime. Now in space, we don't know. Another thing that we believe, banks will be set up that will be criminally oriented. And we know an example of this is BCCI. That was a major criminal bank set up by criminals for criminals, and that's all it was. And there were some dodgy relations with, let's say, intelligence agencies with these things, and we see that will happen too in space. And how BCCI morphed into other things. Did it die? Well, don't know. The hedge funds that have histories.
so our friend James Cambias, who is a talented science fiction author who's written about space piracy, has asked a very intriguing question, which is, could money laundering use non-existent spacecrafts? I'm like, wow, Mark, I never thought of that, but that's pretty clever. He says, could I buy a satellite that doesn't really exist and then sell it to someone else, turning my illegal cash into legal profits? It would be hard to verify that the satellite even exists or that its ownership had really changed. Now, I think what our American attorney would say is that this is absolutely impossible for any spacecraft that has anything to do with an American business. If because there's too many agencies and licenses. Now, if something like this were happening kind of offshore, maybe. I don't know. It's an interesting
Well,
question.
there is. Let me address that though. There is a company that in Australia called VBX or VXB. I remember seeing them in a Google presentation on space probably about 6 weeks ago. This is a company that will create bespoke blueprints for you on any hardware connected to space that you want. They will not manufacture it, but they will provide. So I went up to them during the after the presentation, and I said, well, if I wanted to create a Corsair that would basically be able to take over a lumbering cargo ship or a rocket that could go faster and more lethal, Could you put that together in blueprints? Because they would use AI and scour the entire literature on this and come up with ways of doing it. They said, yeah, we could do that. And why are you asking about this? And I told them that about the book and what we were up to. And one of the fellows turned white, literally turned white. He goes, oh, Lord. Now, I found out later, one of our advisors, Gordon Rossler, who has advised you and I every step of the way of our book and our think tank and all the areas that we are involved in, he told us that the head of the Defense Innovation Unit actually spent a great deal of time with this company.
So we've heard, so Dennis Ben-Susan, who is a space insurance expert, has said he is happy to answer our questions. I'm going to unmute Dennis if he wants to share some remarks with us.
Yeah, thank you, and Mark. Good to see you, and thank you for the webinar today. Yeah, I've been in the space insurance industry for 20 years, so I feel like I can provide some further detail on the question which was asked just previously. I think, you have to imagine a world where space is becoming the same way as marine in the 18th century and aviation in the early 20th century, where space become the sort of a pretty mass market mode of transportation. But even before then, we will see the need for insurers to react to, in exactly the same way it happened for marine and aviation, to react to events, basically. So at the moment, it's a very close circle. Maybe not more than 500 people have been to space. But as soon as we're going to get towards bigger numbers and bigger endeavors, space insurance would follow in close step. And there is no war or criminal insurance at the moment for space, but that was the case as well for marine and aviation when those activities were at the stage where space is today. Marine start to have a war and criminal insurance product and market when basically piracy started on the sea, on the high seas, and especially when piracy started again recently on the coast of Somalia and in the Red Sea. And that became a very lucrative market for insurers until today, with what happening in Yemen. For aviation, the moment was September 11. Before September 11, there was no coverage, or basically there was a coverage for terrorism and criminal activity within aviation policy. But after September 11, every single policy was cancelled the next day. That's what brought all the plane on the ground. And until insurance was reestablished, a week after that, no plane could take off. And that was the creation, literally, of ab nihilo of aviation, terrorism, and war coverage, which was made out of the typical airline insurance policy. So that market was created a week after September 11, and today it's another thriving market. For space, every criminal activity, warlike activity, political activity leading to either damages on assets, space asset, or third-party liability exposure is explicitly excluded today. And the reason for that is there isn't much to cover, and there hasn't been any demand from space operator. But you can bet that on the day where something large and would happen, space insurers would try to provide coverage for those events. And I think we're not very far off that day, with commercial satellite becoming more and more targets, because space now is part of the war domain, as as has been mentioned many times in the last few years, satellite are being targeted and satellite services are being targeted. And in the future, there are a lot of scenario where criminal activities and political activity and military activity could be involved. And at this stage, space insurance, which is a reactive market by nature, it reacts to event, would create those kind of products to benefit for space users. Have,
Well,
have I
yeah.
have I answered your question?
Good. This is like a bonus webinar on top of it. It's great. Thank you, Dennis.
Yeah, Dennis is really the true expert.
Interesting. And there's some good comments in the chat, which I definitely encourage you to read through. Some comments from Patrick Lynn, who's another advisor to us, about the potential for CubeSats, which are very small and hard to track, to be a potential vehicle for money laundering, and some comments on insurance and acts of God and that sort of thing. So let's just see if there's any other questions. Okay, so there's no other questions. If you have other questions, you can definitely email us. We'd love to have the dialogue continue. Otherwise, I want to thank you very much for being with us today. And as I said, we'll be circulating the recording, and we have a couple of requests for the slides. So just let us know by email if you want our slides. Okay. Otherwise, thank you so much for being with us today, and we'll hope
we
to be
appreciate
together
you
on
giving
another
us your
webinar
time.
in the next few months.
And there'll be more of these type of webinars in not too everybody at home. But thanks for your time, and we're up.
Very good. Yeah.